They thought the nightmare was over. But the real fear began after Germany surrendered. September 14th, 1945. A British detention camp outside Nottingham. At dawn, a sound echoed through the wooden barracks. 3 sharp knocks. Not the violent pounding they expected from enemy soldiers, but something colder. Deliberate. Human. Inside, 23 women froze. Blankets slipped from their hands. Eyes darted to the door. The youngest, Greta, barely 19, pressed herself into a corner, whispering the same prayer she'd once said beside her mother's bed. They had heard the stories, whispered warnings in the Bund Deutsche Mädel meetings, tales of what happened to captured women, Russian hands in the night, nurses dragged from field hospitals, girls vanishing as cities fell. And they were told the British were worse, because they'd smile while breaking you. "They'll make us strip," Liesl muttered, voice cracking. "Then we won't," someone hissed back. "We won't take our clothes off." The handle turned. The hinges groaned. What happened next defied every story they'd been told. A truth so buried, even the archives forgot it. Stay with me, because this is one of World War II's most forgotten chapters. And hit subscribe if you believe history's real stories deserve to be heard. 3 British guards stood framed in the doorway, silhouettes carved against the pale morning light. Their khaki uniforms were crisp, pressed to perfection, the kind of order that spoke of discipline, not brutality. The faint smell of soap and tobacco drifted in with them, oddly human, almost comforting. One guard, older, with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, held a clipboard under one arm. Another carried something wrapped neatly in brown paper. The third, barely older than the women themselves, kept his gaze fixed somewhere above their heads, as though he couldn't bear to meet their eyes. "Guten Morgen," the man with the clipboard said carefully, his accent thick but understandable. "We've brought breakfast." The word hung in the air. Breakfast. Not orders to undress, not inspection, not punishment, just breakfast. The women stared, uncertain if they'd heard correctly. For weeks, fear had been their only constant, the kind that sits under your ribs and hums like an electric current. Every knock on the door meant danger. Every man in uniform meant power. But this didn't fit any of the stories they'd been told. The guard with the brown paper package stepped forward, moving slowly, deliberately. He set the bundle on the rough wooden table in the center of the barracks, then unfolded it with practiced care. The smell hit first. Bread. Real bread. Warm, golden, soft. The crust cracked faintly as the air touched it. Alongside it, a tin of margarine, a jar of marmalade, and, impossibly, a glass bottle of milk. The older guard spoke again, glancing at his clipboard. "We'll be back in an hour with hot water for washing," he said evenly. "Then you'll register your names and units. No rush. Eat first." And then they left. The door clicked shut behind them. Not locked. It took a few seconds for that to register. The door was unlocked. They could have opened at any time. No one moved. The silence was thick, vibrating with disbelief. Then Greta, the youngest, just 19, began to cry. Soft, shaky sobs that broke whatever spell had held them. Because this wasn't how enemies behaved. These women hadn't expected to become prisoners of war. Most had never expected to leave Germany at all. They weren't soldiers, not in the traditional sense. They were the invisible machinery that kept the German war machine turning. Communications auxiliaries, radio operators, telephone clerks, typists, cipher assistants. They'd come from the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the women's labour service, handpicked for their precision and obedience. They wore neat grey-blue uniforms marked by the eagle and swastika. They'd been told they were indispensable. The backbone behind the front lines, the silent hands feeding the war effort across continents. And then, when everything collapsed, no one told them anything. Liesl Hartmann, 24, had spent the war behind a radio desk in Schleswig-Holstein, transcribing weather reports and supply lists in a room that smelled of machine oil and stale coffee. On May 6, 1945, 2 days before the official surrender, she'd simply stood up when British troops entered the compound, raised her hands, and waited. No firefight, no resistance, just quiet surrender. Margaret Fischer, 31, had been a surgical nurse outside Hamburg. She'd held boys' hands as they died, amputated limbs by candlelight, and learned to sleep through artillery. When the fighting stopped, she walked outside still wearing her blood-stained apron and asked a British medic if she could keep working. He'd said no. And Greta Schultz, barely 19, had spent 3 months in a communications bunker beneath Berlin, typing messages she didn't understand for units that no longer existed. When word spread that Hitler was dead, she'd felt nothing, just a hollow quiet. The Russians came days later. She fled west with the refugees, her boots falling apart, until she collapsed at a British checkpoint near Lübeck. The soldier who found her gave her water. She'd told him everything. By August 1945, nearly 3,000 German women from these auxiliary branches had been rounded up across the British zone. Most were processed quickly, then sent back to the ruins of Germany. But a few hundred, women who'd worked in sensitive communications roles or had been captured in complex territories, were sent west, to Britain. Their journey across the Channel was a nightmare painted in grey. They were herded aboard a transport ship at Cuxhaven on a fog-drenched morning. No one told them their destination. Rumours spread like infection that they were being taken to America or Canada, or maybe just out to sea to be quietly drowned. Below deck, 200 women were packed into a cargo hold that still smelled of oil and ammunition. The air grew foul, thick with heat and fear. Someone vomited, then another. The sound spread. The stench became unbearable. "I thought we'd suffocate," Liesl would write years later. Or drown. Either way, I couldn't imagine arriving anywhere alive. But they didn't drown. After 36 hours, the engines slowed. They heard gulls, then voices, English voices calling coordinates. The hatch opened. Light flooded the hold like revelation. "Up! Everyone up!" They climbed into daylight, blinking, dazed. Before them stretched a port they later learned was Harwich. Cranes, warehouses, rows of trucks. Men shouting orders, unloading supplies, and everywhere, abundance. Trucks overflowing with crates of food, piles of timber, mountains of coal. Beyond the docks, green fields. Real green, not ash grey, not cratered. Germany was starving. Britain, even after the Blitz, seemed alive. They were loaded into trains, real passenger coaches, not cattle cars. Given sandwiches, white bread, ham, a sliver of cheese. Greta ate hers in 3 bites and wept. As the train rolled north, they saw villages untouched by war, homes with roofs, churches with steeples, children playing in meadows. Margareta pressed her face to the glass. "They didn't suffer," she whispered. Not like we did, but she was wrong. Britain had suffered, through the Blitz, through blockades and rationing. The difference was survival. Germany had been ground to dust. By sunset, the train pulled into Nottinghamshire. Their new home, a former country estate, requisitioned by the military. The manor still stood, though now it bristled with barbed wire, guard towers and rows of wooden barracks. It wasn't paradise, but it had running water, heat, food. That night the women lay awake, waiting for cruelty that never came. And the next morning came the knock, not with fists, not with commands, but with breakfast. Bread, marmalade, and milk. That moment, that quiet, ordinary act, was where everything they believed began to unravel. The knock on the door had changed everything. Breakfast had arrived instead of orders. That simple act of humanity rippled through the women's minds, challenging every expectation they had carried from Germany. But as the days passed, it became clear that this wasn't a one-off. The kindness, the normalcy, was part of the routine. And routine was harder to process than brutality. That first afternoon, a woman in a Red Cross uniform arrived, middle-aged, British, with tired eyes but gentle hands. Through a translator, she explained that each woman would receive a medical examination. Voluntary, she emphasized, though strongly recommended given the conditions endured during transport. The word examination sent a ripple of tension through the barracks. Euphemisms for violation had been drilled into them for years. Girls in uniform learned quickly what to expect when someone examined them. "I'll go first," Margaret said quietly. She was the oldest, the one who'd seen the most, the one whose courage carried the others. "If it's bad, I'll warn you." The room was clean, almost clinical. There was no table, just a chair. A female doctor checked her pulse, listened to her lungs, peered into her throat. She noted minor dehydration, slight malnutrition, and the early signs of a respiratory infection. She prescribed rest, extra rations, and penicillin, the miraculous drug that had only been whispered about in Germany. "That's all?" Margaret asked. "That's all," the doctor replied. "Unless there's something else you'd like to discuss." Margaret returned to the barracks in disbelief. "Just a doctor. That's all." she repeated to the others, almost laughing in relief. Meals arrived 3 times a day, simple but adequate. Porridge and tea for breakfast, soup and bread for lunch, meat stews with root vegetables for dinner, sometimes pudding. The women performed only minor cleaning duties within their quarters. There was no shouting, no corporal punishment, no cruel entertainment. Guards maintained distance, professional but not hostile. Even recreation was permitted. A radio broadcast played carefully censored programs in the common room. The women could listen, write letters, or simply rest. Greta, whose fragility had defined her first days, cried at unexpected moments. The taste of warm tea, the weight of a clean blanket, the ability to sleep through a full night. "I don't understand," she whispered to Liesl one evening. "Why are they kind?" Liesl, whose mind had long learned to read between the lines, had a theory. "Maybe because they can afford to be," she said slowly. "They won. They don't need to prove anything." It didn't fully explain it. Kindness came in so many forms it was almost frightening. One day, a package arrived for Liesl. Not from home, not mail from Germany, which was still barely functioning. It was from the camp administration. Inside, a thick woolen cardigan, worn but clean, and a note in careful English, translated for her. "Stay warm." Another day, Greta mentioned, almost casually, that it was her birthday. She hadn't expected anyone to remember. That evening, the camp cook, a British woman named Mrs. Davies, appeared with a small cake. She had sacrificed her own ration sugar to bake it. 20 years old deserves a cake," she said gruffly. Greta sobbed. 10 minutes passed before she could even take a bite. And then there was Thomas. The young guard, who had avoided their eyes that first morning, began teaching them English phrases during evening recreation. "Not officially," he said, "just might be useful." Thomas was 22, had landed at Normandy and fought through France. He rarely spoke of what he'd seen, but he shared pieces of himself. Photographs of his farm, his dog, his mother. Slowly, the women began seeing him as a person first, a soldier second, and a British officer last. Margaret, trained in triage and empathy, realized she was doing the same. She could see the boy in uniform, not the enemy. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. Weeks passed. Winter approached. The women learned the rationing system, strict but fair. Guards ate the same meals as they did. Mrs. Davies mentioned that she had given up sugar to bake Greta's cake. A small kindness, but one with enormous symbolic weight. Christmas arrived in December, not lavish but warm. Evergreen branches hung from windows. Small handmade decorations adorned the common room. Carols were sung in German and English. Guards brought extra coal for the stoves. Someone produced a handful of chocolate bars from a care package. American chocolate distributed among the women. Margaret unwrapped hers slowly, the sweetness nearly overwhelming. She'd forgotten what chocolate tasted like. Singing became a nightly ritual, at first quietly, hesitant, then louder, with pride. German songs, German voices. The Brahms lullabies they had sung as children echoed softly. Thomas listened, standing in the doorway, smiling. "My grandmother used to sing that," he said. Different words, same tune. Funny how things travel. The women began confronting something larger, the collapse of their certainty. They'd been trained, indoctrinated, taught to fear and hate the British. They had been told that captured Germans could expect nothing but cruelty. Yet here they were, fed, clothed, given medical attention, allowed small pleasures, and treated with dignity. Everything we were told. How do we reconcile it? Anna asked one night. She was a teacher before the war, and her mind sought patterns, cause and effect. Liesl's answer was simple. Maybe we don't. Maybe we just accept that we were lied to. But accepting that truth meant accepting more. That Germany's promised greatness was a lie. That the ideology that had consumed their youth, pride and identity was poisoned. That their enemy, the British, had acted with mercy when mercy wasn't required. Letters from home complicated things further. November 8th, 1945. Liesl received a letter from her mother. Germany was a graveyard. Ruined apartments, starvation, no heat. And yet, her mother asked about her treatment in Britain. How could Liesl explain she had 3 meals a day, warmth, safety, and kindness while her mother starved? The guilt gnawed at her, but she ate anyway. There was no other choice. Every act of British decency, every small kindness, was another cognitive riddle for the women. They were taught to hate, but here was evidence to the contrary. They had to reconcile the reality with everything they had learned, and it was slowly reshaping them. By the time spring arrived, repatriation loomed. Documents, small sums of money, and trains back to a Germany still in ruins. Many women hesitated to leave Britain. It was safer here, more humane, but nationality demanded return. Margaret found her neighbourhood unrecognisable, her hospital reduced to rubble. Liesl returned to find her parents' home occupied by refugees. Greta had no home to return to, no family. Yet they shared one thing: the memory of that breakfast, that knock, that human moment. It was a seed planted. The war had ended, but understanding and reconciliation were just beginning. Repatriation in the spring of 1946 was a mixture of relief and dread. Documents were issued, small sums of money handed over, and the women boarded trains bound for a Germany that was still scarred by war. Many of them hesitated to leave Britain. Despite the austerity and rationing, this country had fed them, sheltered them, and treated them as human beings. It was safer here than in the ruins they were returning to. Margaret returned to Hamburg to discover a neighbourhood obliterated by bombings. Her hospital, where she had trained and worked tirelessly, was a cratered shell. Family members had either perished or survived by extraordinary means, leaving her to navigate the black market chaos that now defined daily life. Neighbours who had once smiled at her became suspicious and angry when she spoke of her time in Britain. "How could you have lived so comfortably while we starved?" they demanded. Margaret did not argue. Survival in post-war Germany was more about pragmatism than pride. Liesl Hartmann returned to Schleswig-Holstein, where her parents' home had been occupied by refugees from the east. There was no room for recriminations, only the necessity of rebuilding. Her fluency in languages and experience in administrative work made her employable by the British occupation authorities, ironically putting her skills, honed for the German war machine, to use helping the very forces she had once been trained to evade. She ignored the whispers, labeling her a collaborator. She had seen firsthand that morality was rarely black and white. Greta, the youngest, faced perhaps the hardest transition. She had lost her entire family in the chaotic final days of the war, leaving her with no home and no anchor. She drifted through occupation zones, taking odd jobs, sleeping in refugee centres, haunted by memories of both destruction and unexpected mercy. For years, she shared nothing of her time in Britain. It felt alien, incongruous with the misery she saw every day. Yet letters, careful, tentative correspondence, slowly rebuilt a network among the women who had shared that transformative winter. By 1953, the bonds forged in that camp coalesced into the first reunion. 8 women, survivors of the same ordeal, gathered in a cafe in Hanover. They compared memories, pieced together the fragments of their experiences, and shared stories of kindness, small gestures, and moments of humanity that had defied all expectation. "Do you ever think about Mrs. Davies?" Greta asked softly, her eyes distant. "All the time," Margaret admitted. "I wrote once, sent it to the camp, hoping it would reach her. Never heard back." "I think about Thomas," Liesl said quietly. "I wonder if he made it home to his farm, if he's still teaching children English phrases." These reunions were more than nostalgia. They were a way to process the shock that kindness could exist amid wartime cruelty, and the deeper realization that the world was not as rigidly divided into heroes and villains as they had been taught. They were reconstructing morality from lived experience, not propaganda. The story of these women caught the attention of a British journalist in 1967. Researching P camps, he stumbled across their accounts and tracked down several of the women. He published an article titled "The Prisoners Who Came Home Changed," which caused a minor scandal in Germany. Critics accused the women of exaggerating British kindness to flatter former captors. Defenders argued their testimony was credible precisely because it was unexpected, difficult to reconcile, and morally complex. Liesl wrote a letter to the editor, published in full. "I do not expect anyone to believe that our imprisonment was pleasant. It was not. We were frightened, displaced, uncertain of our futures, but the British did not abuse us. They did not torture us. They treated us as human beings, even though we were the enemy. That shocked us, because we had been taught to expect the opposite. That shock, that moment when expectation collided with reality, changed us. It forced us to question everything we had been told, everything we had believed. For some of us, that questioning led to understanding. For others, it led to despair. But it was necessary. Germany had to confront its lies, and we had to confront ours. The British didn't set out to teach us anything. They simply behaved with decency. That it seemed revolutionary to us tells you everything you need to know about what we had become. The winter they had spent in the camp near Nottingham left indelible marks. The small acts, a slice of warm bread, a birthday cake made from someone else's ration, a boy showing photos of his dog, became touchstones for understanding human decency in the aftermath of catastrophe. The knock on the door, the breakfast, the unexpected generosity of strangers, these were the seeds from which something greater could grow. Germany would spend decades confronting its past, sorting lies from truth, guilt from survival, cruelty from mercy. These small moments of decency did not rewrite history, but they offered a framework for reconciliation, a way to begin rebuilding humanity from the ruins of ideology. The British guards who had delivered that breakfast likely never gave it another thought. Routine, professional duty, a moment of mercy. But for the 23 women inside, it was epical. It was the beginning of doubt, of understanding, and of moral awakening. These were the moments that shaped their post-war lives, influencing their choices, their relationships, and their willingness to bridge divides that had seemed insurmountable. Some women dedicated themselves to reconciliation work, helping to heal the rifts between post-war communities. Others withdrew, struggling privately with memories of what Germany had promised and what it had delivered. And yet all carried the memory of that morning, the moment when fear met kindness, when the rigidity of ideology cracked against simple human decency. This wasn't unique. Across P camps, similar scenes played out. Captured enemies treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, sometimes exceeding expectations. Each act of humane treatment was a ripple, subtle but transformative. For some, it was a turning point in understanding the war's moral complexities. For others, it was a private reconciliation with conscience. History often remembers battles, leaders, and political shifts, but it is also shaped in quiet moments. A guard who delivers bread instead of violence, a cook who sacrifices her ration sugar, a young soldier sharing photos of his dog. These moments didn't win wars, but they cultivated the slow, painstaking work of restoring humanity, of reconstructing morality where ideology had failed. The women who had screamed at the knock on that September morning spent the rest of their lives unpacking what followed. Fear, surprise, gratitude, guilt, and the slow realization that kindness could exist even between enemies. Some embraced it, using their experience as a foundation for new beliefs. Others buried it, too painful to reconcile with loyalty to Germany. None forgot it, and so it remains one of the untold stories of World War II. The knock on the door, the slice of bread, the human kindness that bridged shattered worlds. These small, overlooked chapters remind us that history is not only made in battles and treaties, but in gestures of decency that ripple across decades. The knock came at dawn. Fear met kindness. Expectation shattered against reality. And in that simple moment, everything changed. Nearly 8 decades have passed, and most of those women have left this world. Margaret passed away in 1998, Liesl in 2003, and Greta in 2011. Their children and grandchildren carry fragments of their experiences, moments so profound they can scarcely be explained. How do you inherit a memory that overturned everything your grandmother believed about right, wrong, and the enemy? Yet the story endures, because such moments demand to be remembered. The knock on the door keeps coming. Even today, in different wars, different camps, and different corners of the world, testing how we respond when fear meets the unknown. Sometimes it brings harm, sometimes unexpected mercy. And in that response, in the choice to act with humanity instead of cruelty, the future is quietly shaped. They had prepared themselves for the worst. They had steeled themselves for humiliation, for control, for punishment. Instead, they received kindness. A simple act, a loaf of bread, shifted everything they thought they knew. It changed the way they saw the world, and in subtle ways, it changed the world itself. Stories like this remind us that history isn't only battles, treaties, and leaders. It's in the small, human moments that echo across generations, moments that test our morality, challenge our assumptions, and demand that we see even the so-called enemy as human. If this story moved you, share it. Let it be a reminder that acts of decency, no matter how small, can alter lives in ways we may never fully measure, and subscribe to keep uncovering the hidden chapters of history that teach us not just what happened, but how humanity can survive even in the darkest times.